Ancient Mesopotamia preserves an unsettling question. Humanity began beneath divine power, yet later generations expanded beyond simple existence. Settlements became cities, communities developed institutions, scribes recorded knowledge, rulers organized kingdoms, builders transformed landscapes. Somewhere within this transformation, sacred traditions describe moments when heavenly powers responded harshly toward mortal society. Could growing human potential have created anxiety among gods? No surviving tablet plainly states such conclusion. So this investigation will separate documented tradition from interpretation and speculation. Still, catastrophe, restriction, endurance, rebuilding, ambition form an intriguing pattern. Perhaps weakness was never humanity's greatest trait. Possibility was. Tell us where you're watching. When humanity began to change, humanity did not become powerful in Mesopotamian stories all at once. The change begins quietly, through ordinary acts that seem insignificant when viewed separately. People settle near rivers. Families become larger communities. Communities organize food, tools, work, worship, and defense. Over time, those small arrangements produce something much larger than any single person. The rise of the city marks a major turning point. A settlement can depend mainly on the people living inside it, but a city creates systems that continue beyond individual lives. Fields must be managed. Water must be directed. Grain must be stored. Buildings require planning. Trade needs rules. Officials keep track of resources while craftsmen develop specialized skills. None of these developments require supernatural power. They require cooperation. That may be the first important change in the human story. People become capable of accomplishing together what one person could never accomplish alone. A wall becomes possible because many hands work toward one purpose. A canal becomes possible because knowledge and effort are organized. A large temple can exist because generations maintain the institution behind it. The result is a new kind of strength. Human society begins accumulating structure. Mesopotamia provides some of the earliest evidence for this transformation. Cities such as Uruk grew into complex centers with large populations. Administration, religious institutions, workshops, and systems of record-keeping. Writing developed partly as a way to manage information, but its consequences reached much further. Once words and numbers could be preserved on clay, information no longer had to disappear when the person who knew it died. A record could be copied. A measurement could be remembered. A transaction could be checked. A name could survive. This changed the relationship between one generation and the next. Knowledge could move forward instead of being recreated from the beginning every time. A young scribe could learn from an older record. A craftsman could inherit techniques developed before his birth. A ruler could study precedents established by earlier kings. Human society therefore became cumulative. One generation added something to what another had already built. That process also changed the scale of human influence. A small group could affect its immediate surroundings. A city could reshape an entire region. Organized communities could control agriculture, trade routes, armies, and political territories. Their decisions could influence people who lived far beyond the walls. The individual remained fragile. The collective became increasingly durable. This distinction matters when reading ancient stories about gods and humans. Mesopotamian religion placed divine beings above mortals in a clear hierarchy. Gods could command forces that humans could not control. They could determine fortune, disaster, kingship, fertility, and death. Human beings remained dependent on a world they did not fully understand. Yet dependence did not prevent development. People continued building, they continued organizing, they continued recording what they learned. They continued creating institutions that could survive the death of their founders. Nothing about this automatically means the gods were frightened. The surviving traditions do not present a simple moment when humanity suddenly became too advanced. The transformation was gradual, and ancient writers were often interested in its consequences rather than describing it as biological evolution. Still, gradual change can create a problem that sudden power cannot. A single powerful person can be removed. A developed society is harder to erase. Once knowledge, institutions, and traditions are shared across a population, they no longer belong entirely to one individual. They become part of the community itself. And as human society became larger and more organized, its presence became harder for the divine world to ignore. The ancient stories provide a clue when human growth stops being ordinary and begins appearing as something capable of disturbing the order established above them. The next question is why that growing presence could become a disturbance. Why human growth became a divine problem. The concern becomes clearer when human growth is placed inside ancient Mesopotamian ideas of order. Gods were connected with the forces that made society, nature, kingship, fertility, disease, and fate function. Humans had a place within that arrangement, and crossing its boundaries could have serious consequences. Population provides the clearest example. In the Atrahasis tradition, people multiply until their presence becomes disruptive to the divine world. The gods hear the noise of humanity and decide that something must be done. The story does not describe modern concerns about technology or biological evolution. It presents a much older problem. A growing human population has become difficult for the gods to tolerate. That detail changes the direction of the story. The issue is no longer whether humans can build cities. The issue is whether their expanding presence can remain within an order controlled by divine powers. A larger population means more settlements, agriculture, movement, and pressure on the surrounding environment. Human activity becomes widespread. What began as a collection of individuals becomes a force that can affect a world around it. Ancient writers understood that growth had consequences. A city needed food. Food required fields and water. Fields required organization. Trade connected distant communities. Kings needed officials and soldiers. Priests maintained institutions. Scribes preserved information. Each layer made society more complex, and complexity could create independence. A person who knows how to grow food is less dependent on chance. A community that stores grain can survive a poor season. A city with organized defenses can resist enemies. A society that records information can preserve lessons after its leaders die. None of these examples proves that the gods feared human progress. They show why growing societies could become increasingly difficult to manage. Another boundary becomes important here: knowledge. Mesopotamian traditions often portray wisdom and sacred knowledge as closely connected with the divine realm. Humans may receive skills from gods, learn special arts, or gain access to information that changes their lives. Knowledge is therefore not treated as something neutral in every story. It can change what people are capable of doing. Once people understand a process, they can teach it. Once a technique is taught, others can improve it. Once an improvement spreads, the entire community benefits. The effect multiplies. This is where human independence begins to look different from individual strength. A mortal does not need to become immortal to become influential. A society can preserve an idea long after the person who first discovered it has disappeared. This creates a deeper tension between divine control and human development. Yet the texts do not say that the gods gathered together because they predicted human technology would eventually surpass them. That would be a modern interpretation, not a direct statement from the surviving sources. The evidence supports something narrower. Human growth could become disruptive enough to provoke divine action. And in the Atrahasis tradition, the response becomes extreme. The gods decide to send a catastrophe against humanity. This is where the story moves from concern to intervention. The decision suggests that reducing human numbers was considered more important than allowing the population to continue unchecked. But the ancient narrative contains a complication that changes everything. Not every divine figure agrees in the same way. One god chooses to protect a human survivor. That choice means the coming disaster will not completely erase the species. The gods may have decided humanity was a problem, but someone within the divine world still believed humanity was worth preserving. That contradiction sets up the next stage of the story, because once catastrophe is chosen, the question is no longer whether the gods are concerned. The question is whether their attempt to control humanity can actually succeed. The attempt to stop humanity, the decision to intervene, turns the ancient story into a struggle over survival. Humanity is no longer simply growing inside the world. The divine council has decided that its presence must be reduced. In the Atrahasis tradition, the answer is a flood, a disaster intended to remove the disturbance created by human population. The scale of the response is striking. The problem begins with noise, but the solution reaches the entire human community. Fields, homes, animals, and settlements are placed at risk. The story presents catastrophe as an instrument of divine control, not as an ordinary natural event understood by modern science. Yet the plan contains a weakness. Atrahasis is warned. The god Enki, known in Sumerian tradition as a protector of humanity and associated with wisdom in the subterranean freshwater realm, finds a way to communicate the danger. Atrahasis builds a vessel and prepares for the coming flood. When the waters arrive, he survives while the surrounding world is overwhelmed. This changes the meaning of the catastrophe. If the intention was simply to reduce the human population, the flood succeeds. If the intention was to erase humanity completely, it fails. One survivor is enough to carry the story forward. The ancient tradition does not portray Enki's action as proof that every god secretly supported humanity. Instead, it reveals disagreement within the divine world. Different gods can have different interests, and divine decisions are not always presented as perfectly unified. That detail is important because it prevents an overly simple interpretation. The story is not necessarily saying that humans were innocent victims of jealous gods, nor does it say that every divine being wanted humanity destroyed. Instead, it presents competing priorities: order, survival, divine authority, and the continuation of human life. Atrahasis survives because knowledge reaches him before the catastrophe. He knows what is coming. He prepares. He acts. Survival, therefore, depends not only on physical strength, but on receiving information and using it correctly. The flood becomes a test of whether humanity can respond when the world around it changes. The answer is yes. The vessel survives. Life survives. Humanity survives. But the ancient narrative does not end with the waters. Survival creates a new problem. If one generation can pass information to another, then destruction does not necessarily end a society's story. The people who remain can rebuild what was lost, and their descendants can inherit what they learned from the catastrophe. This is where the story becomes more complicated than a simple tale of divine punishment. The gods possess forces capable of overwhelming humans. Humans possess the ability to adapt. Those are different forms of power. A flood can destroy a settlement. It cannot guarantee that the knowledge required to build another settlement has disappeared. A ruler can die. The customs of his people can remain. A building can collapse. The techniques used to construct it can be taught again. The catastrophe therefore creates a boundary between destruction and permanent erasure. The flood can remove bodies. It can damage institutions. It can break the continuity of a community. But the possibility of rebuilding remains as long as someone survives with enough knowledge to begin again. That possibility is not presented in the ancient text as a scientific theory of human advancement. It is an interpretation of what survival means within the narrative. The important point is that the story itself refuses to end with humanity's destruction. The survivors remain, and once they remain, the human story can start again. That is the moment when the ancient question becomes more difficult. If divine power could bring catastrophe but could not determine what happened afterward, then perhaps an important part of the story begins after the flood. Humanity has survived the attempt to stop it. Now, it must rebuild. What survived after the catastrophe? The flood is ended, but the human story does not return to its starting point. A survivor carries knowledge of what happened, and later communities inherit traditions shaped by catastrophe. The important change is not simply that people are alive again. It is that human society can rebuild by carrying information forward. People can remember how fields were cultivated, how tools were made, how buildings were constructed, and how communities were organized. Even when one generation disappears, another can learn from what remains. This process creates accumulation. A child can learn something that a parent learned before them. A craftsman can improve a technique instead of inventing it again. A scribe can copy an older record. A ruler can inherit laws, customs, and administrative practices established by earlier generations. Human progress, therefore, does not depend on one extraordinary individual. It depends on transmission. A method can move from one teacher to an apprentice. A story can pass through families. A record can survive its author. Each transfer adds another link to the chain. Inheritance steadily carries the past forward. The same principle appears in Mesopotamian cities. Buildings were repaired or replaced. Institutions survived changes in rulers. Religious traditions continued through generations. Records preserved names, transactions, laws, and stories long after the people who first produced them had disappeared. Individual lives are temporary. Shared knowledge can last much longer. The distinction becomes important when considering what the flood actually accomplished. It could destroy a population, but it could not guarantee that everything the population knew would disappear. Even a small number of survivors could carry fragments of earlier experience into the future. A farming method could spread again. A craft could be taught to new apprentices. A story could be repeated until it became part of cultural memory. A written record could be copied by people who had never met its original author. The result is cumulative change. One generation does not begin with an empty world. It begins with inheritance. They understand that survival is not only about remaining alive, it is also about preserving enough information to make another beginning possible. The gods could determine whether a particular city survived. They could send a flood. They could alter the fortunes of kings. But the stories repeatedly place human beings in the role of rebuilding after loss. This does not make humans equal to divine beings. Ancient Mesopotamian religion still presents gods as vastly superior in power and status. Mortals remain subject to death, disease, famine, warfare, and forces beyond their control. Human beings can accumulate. A single lifetime is short, but the chain between generations can be long. Skills can travel farther than their creators. Stories can outlive the people who first told them. Records can preserve information beyond the lifespan of their authors. A community learns. Its descendants inherit the lesson. They add something new. Their descendants inherit that addition. The process continues. This gives the human population a quality that an individual does not possess: long-term development through inheritance. It also changes how the flood can be understood. The catastrophe was designed to interrupt human existence, yet the survivor becomes the beginning of another chapter. The disaster does not determine the final outcome. Human beings do, not because they overpower the gods, but because they adapt to what happens around them. This is where the title's question becomes more interesting. If the gods feared what humans could become, the fear may not have been about one sudden transformation. It may have involved a slower process in which every generation inherited more than the last. But the ancient texts never explicitly make that claim. To understand what the story can actually tell us, the final distinction must be made between the ancient record, reasonable interpretation, and modern speculation. What the gods may really have feared, the ancient texts do not give a direct sentence saying that the gods feared human evolution. They describe something more complex. Humans multiply, divine powers react, catastrophe follows, and at least one survivor carries the human story forward. From that sequence, a broader interpretation can be developed, but it must remain separate from what the tablets actually state. The first level is the ancient record. Mesopotamian traditions describe gods and mortals occupying different positions within the universe. They tell of creation, population, divine decisions, catastrophe, survival, kingship, knowledge, and the rebuilding of human society. In the Atrahasis tradition, the growing human population becomes disruptive enough that the gods decide to act. That is what the story gives us. The second level is interpretation. The flood can be understood as a story about limits. The gods possess enormous power, while humans remain mortal and vulnerable. Yet human beings have another characteristic. They can pass what they learn to people who come after them. A person's life ends. The knowledge does not necessarily end with it. A city can be destroyed, but its people can build another. A ruler can disappear while laws and traditions remain. A craftsman can die while an apprentice continues the craft. A scribe can vanish while copied records preserve information. Across generations, those fragments can become something much larger. This is the central idea of the documentary. The possible danger was not that one human would suddenly become divine. The more interesting possibility is that humanity could become increasingly capable through accumulation. One generation begins with what the previous generation discovered. It adds something. The next inherits both. Over centuries, small improvements can become enormous changes. This kind of development does not require immortality. It requires transmission, and transmission makes a population difficult to permanently reset. A catastrophe can destroy a generation. It cannot necessarily destroy everything that generation has already passed onward. That may explain why the flood story is more revealing as a survival narrative than as a destruction narrative. The waters demonstrate divine power, but the survivor demonstrates the limits of that power. The third level is speculation. Modern alternative history theories sometimes take stories about divine intervention and interpret them as evidence that advanced beings deliberately restricted humanity. Some versions imagine attempts to control human intelligence, technology, population, or independence. Those ideas can be fascinating, but the surviving Mesopotamian evidence does not establish them. There is no clear ancient statement that extraterrestrial beings feared human technological progress. There is no confirmed tablet describing a program designed to suppress human evolution. Such interpretations belong to modern speculation rather than established history. The ancient material is powerful without requiring those additions. Its deeper question may concern creation and control. A creator can establish boundaries. A ruler can establish laws. A society can establish institutions. But what happens when later generations inherit those boundaries and begin changing the world around them? Mesopotamian stories repeatedly return to that tension. The gods establish order. Humans live within it. Humans sometimes cross its limits. The divine world responds, yet the human story continues. This produces the strongest reversal in the entire narrative. Perhaps the gods did not fear that humans would become immortal or literally become gods. Perhaps the more difficult possibility was that humans could become increasingly independent through everything they inherited from one another. The individual remained weak. The chain between generations became strong. And that chain could carry ideas, skills, traditions, and ambitions farther than any single life could reach. The ancient texts never call this human evolution in the modern scientific sense. But they leave behind a question that still feels remarkably relevant. If every generation inherits more than the one before it, can any creator completely control what its creation eventually becomes? Perhaps the gods could determine how humanity began. The more uncertain question was whether they could determine where humanity would ultimately go. The tablets never plainly say the gods feared human evolution, but they preserve a stranger possibility. Humanity could survive catastrophe, inherit knowledge, rebuild, and become something no single generation could predict. Perhaps the real mystery is not why humans were created, but whether anyone could control what they became. Watch the next ancient mystery.